The NFL announced the finalists for their season-long awards, MVP, Offensive Player of the Year, etc. So we're going to do the same thing for the Chicago Bears. And as I started to go through this exercise, a surprising name kept coming up in my consideration for multiple spots. Teven Jenkins.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook, join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk, and make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. Today's episode is presented by PrizePicks. PrizePicks is daily fantasy made easy. Pick 2 to 6 players, and if they score more or less than their PrizePicks projections, you can win up to 25 times your money on your entry. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with our promo code LOCKEDON. That's prizepicks.com, promo code LOCKEDON. On the show today, we look at who should be deserving of Bears season awards: MVP, Offensive Defensive Player of the Year, Rookie of the Year, Coach of the Year, Comeback Player of the Year, Most Improved Player, etc. And it struck me as we go through this process that, and particularly offensively, there's not a lot to pick between there. Even defensively is not great either. And over again, I kept coming back to Teven Jenkins as a name, and it stood out to me as just him being one of these few and far between highlights, bright spots, silver linings to this otherwise futile 2022 season, and that his journey was remarkable through all this, and we'll kind of see how everything pieces together here. Because, of course, the first thing everyone's going to start with is MVP, and there's not really a debate, right? There's not really a question beyond Justin Fields. He was the most valuable player to the Chicago Bears when he is not on the field versus when he is on the field. It makes the biggest difference. Other players had plenty of value to this team, but there wasn't another guy who would miss time and have a bigger impact in his absence than Justin Fields, and he was often the main thing keeping this team in games, even throughout. As much as people wanted to get mad at how things ended in some of those games, he was the only reason they got close enough to even be close and have a shot at the end of those games. So I don't think we need to spend a lot of time looking at other possible candidates here or debating. It's just Justin Fields was clearly the MVP of this Bears team. But it gets interesting for me when we talk about Offensive Player of the Year. And I want to make Offensive Player of the Year not just also Justin Fields. I don't like giving the same person 2 awards for essentially the same thing, right? Like the Offensive Player of the Year other than Justin Fields, because the reason why he was the MVP was because he was so good offensively. So let's not give him the recognition twice for the same thing. But outside of Fields, who deserves an Offensive Player of the Year award here for the Bears, right? Because David Montgomery was the workhorse, but kind of a little bit of a down year from him production wise. He was trying his best. He played hard, but it's just it wasn't wow, he was great all season long and was just, this go-to guy at all times. It was he was very good, but wasn't stellar. I mean, Cole Kmet had a step forward. He was the Bears' leading receiver and had a lot of touchdowns, but he wasn't a dynamic player that you look around and go oh yeah, the Bears, he was a breakout player, huge year, great. It was good, but it wasn't earth-shattering. The Bears didn't have that offensively. I found myself first going to Khalil Herbert for what he did in the first 10 weeks of the season. I mean, he was their leading rusher and leading the NFL in yards per carry. He was on pace to be clearly the Offensive Player of the Year for the Bears. But when you only play 10 games healthy at that stretch, and then 3 more at the end of the year where he just was not the same guy, I don't know if I can hand the Offensive Player of the Year award to a half season of greatness from Khalil Herbert either. So that's where I come back to Teven Jenkins. He was the one guy who was really good all season and was their most consistent offensive lineman, was a lot better this season, despite, everything that happened in the preseason and in training camp and the rumors about a potential trade and that there being a disconnect there and maybe a hold-in type situation. Like, we weren't really sure what was going on there, but we weren't sure whether Teven Jenkins would be a Bears player this season. And yet ends up being a real gem on that offensive line. Feels like he's locked in that right guard spot as a solid starter for the future, or maybe they could try him again at right tackle. But like, he was really good and might have been the most consistent player on offense, not named Justin Fields this season. So like, I find myself wanting to make Teven Jenkins Offensive Player of the Year, but I also like Khalil Herbert as the asterisk there. I'd love to hear what you think for Bears Offensive Player of the Year. In the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, on the comments for this video, let me know what you think for OPOY, because not Justin Fields, right? We know Justin Fields was most valuable player, and a lot of that would be Offensive Player of the Year. But beyond that, like, Mooney wasn't what we wanted him to be. Claypool wasn't what he wanted him to be. The rest of the offensive line wasn't great. So it's like, to me, it's like Montgomery, Herbert, Kmet, Teven Jenkins is kind of your four. And I'm not in love with anyone individually as that guy, but I'd find myself leaning Teven Jenkins or Khalil Herbert with a 10-game asterisk next to it. Defensive Player of the Year, I think a little bit easier for me. It's got to be Eddie Jackson. He stepped up in a big way and had a bit of a bounce back this season, got closer to that 2018 form. We saw more interceptions. We saw him more comfortable, more natural on that back end, despite not really having a ton of help around him, or certainly in front of him, in terms of the pass rush and the front seven on this defense. You could make an argument maybe for Jack Sanborn with all the tackles that he had. Jaquan Brisker certainly had some big moments too. Jalen Johnson continues to be, Jalen Johnson level cornerbacking. But I feel like Eddie Jackson was a step above the rest of that group as like clearly the most consistent best player on this defense, despite some real flashes from a number of other guys. But it's just like Jackson was the rock on that back end, and it was a bit noticeable when he was no longer that last line of defense in this Chicago Bears secondary. So I'm still kind of torn on the Offensive Player of the Year thing, but I feel a lot better about, of course, MVP Justin Fields, and pretty steady on Defensive Player of the Year, Eddie Jackson. Let's get into some of the other award situations. I think it gets a little bit murky from here as well. I don't know that there's obvious guys for most of the rest of these spots, but we'll go through, Comeback Player of the Year, Most Improved Player, Coach of the Year, and Rookie of the Year as we continue this episode of Locked On Bears. This podcast is sponsored by our friends at FanDuel Sportsbook. We're really excited about them being our new sports betting partner for Locked On because they're the number one sportsbook in America. And if you're new to FanDuel, that's just fine because they have so many great features that make betting on sports fun and easy. Right now, new customers can join today and get started with $150 in free bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. You just sign up at FanDuel.com/LockedOn. They've got all your favorite bets, from the money line to point spreads and player props. Plus, you can even combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with same-game parlays. You want to make these playoff games this weekend, the championship games, mean a little bit more to you. You put a little money down, and all of a sudden, you have stakes in the game, instead of it just being four teams that you don't really have strong feelings for otherwise. All this on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. So don't miss out. Place your first $5 bet to get $150 in free bets, win or lose, at FanDuel.com/LockedOn. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. So we know that the big fish at the top of this Bears team are at least Jackson and Fields, a little bit easier to pin down. Their offense was kind of lacking in that area. But what about on this Bears coaching staff? Coach of the Year. Specifically for this one, I open it up to head coach, offensive, defensive coordinator, or also position coaches that particularly did a good job coaching up their position to have that position maybe play better than we thought they would, or get players that we didn't think were that good to play better than we thought they were at that position. And so, I was considering, just given all the turnover and the work the Bears had to do in the secondary, that their defensive backs coach, but he left this offseason. So it feels a little bit weird to kind of give the outgoing defensive backs coach the Coach of the Year award, and also too that, it wasn't that they were so great, but James Rowe had to kind of, work with undrafted rookie free agents being thrown in there all of a sudden. And there were certainly some rough moments, and I feel like the lack of progress from Kyler Gordon is also a little bit what holds me back there, but I do think he was tasked with the impossible, and the secondary could have been a lot worse. So what I come back to then is like, okay, well, where were the strengths of this team? Safety, yeah, but we kind of knew there was a lot of talent in that safety position. And then it's kind of what we talked about on offense, like Justin Fields. They got Justin Fields to be the NFL's like leading rusher up there, like in terms of, yards per carry and the big moments that he made. I mean, he was setting NFL records or getting certainly Bears records and really close to NFL records for rushing yards in a season by a quarterback. And so I'm torn whether you make it quarterbacks coach Andrew Janocko or just offensive coordinator Luke Getsy. I know Bears fans had their qualms at times with Luke Getsy's play calling. I think literally every fan base in the NFL will at times have qualms with their play caller. And just because there are moments when you feel like maybe he didn't handle that situation well or this situation well, I don't think is a reason to think he's not a good play caller, right? Or is a reason to be concerned about him long term. Because I think even 49ers fans maybe sometimes don't like things that Kyle Shanahan calls or Andy Reid in Kansas City, right? No play caller is perfect at all times and always a few steps ahead. And we don't need to sit here and debate every minutia of every decision Luke Getsy made this season, but there was a stretch here when Justin Fields was healthy and the offense was clicking that they were scoring close to 30 points a game against some pretty good opponents in that time. And a lot of that was because of what Justin Fields was doing. And a lot of that was then Luke Getsy and the scheme that they built around Justin Fields, getting him more directly involved in the running game, helping facilitate the passing game with a little bit more of Justin Fields' style, more play action, more shots, more moving the pocket a bit. And it felt like, certainly compared to Matt Nagy last year, the Bears found a lot closer to that ideal formula of what can work for Fields on offense. And you got to give the offensive coordinator a lot of the credit for that. I come back to Janocko because we did see a lot of demonstrable progress from Justin Fields from week 1 to week 18, or week 1 to week 16, because at the very end there, things kind of trailed off against the Lions there. But for a lot of the season, we saw Fields improve in very real and important ways. And you got to give the quarterback's coach some real credit for that. I also feel like a lot of it was just Fields getting experience on the field. Like he needed to be out there. And I don't know that the quarterback's coach was necessarily the full reason. It's always impossible to tell, okay, how much is coaching and how much is just the player themselves growing and being talented. So there's flaws in both candidates, but I find myself coming back to Luke Getsy and feeling like he was not perfect, but I think he did more than we were expecting or got more out of this offense than other coaches might have, given the lack of talent at wide receiver and on the offensive line and the injuries that they had. This team could run the ball well, and this team was in a lot of those situations late in games. And I think the scheme and the play calling was a positive influence on that. And maybe we're just so beaten up from the scheme and the play calling being such a concern in the recent years that when we get one that's decent, it's like, oh, we got to praise that and give that the award because it was actually good. And maybe we came from such a low comparison point that we're overinflating how good Luke Getsy was this season. But still, I don't see a lot of other super intriguing options for a Bears coach of the year. I don't think Alan Williams deserves it. I don't think Richard Hightower, special teams coach, probably not so much. And the position coaches are hard to find one that's like, yeah, that group was solid through and through, top to bottom on the roster. I wondered about maybe the linebacker position with guys stepping up into those roles. And I wasn't enough to go with the coach of the year being the linebackers coach. That's Dave Borgonzi. But I do think your rookie of the year should be Jack Sanborn. A lot of people are going to go with Jaquan Brisker in that spot. And I do feel some of the asterisks that we talked about when it came to Khalil Herbert and just not playing a full season's worth of games as a starter. Sanborn officially played in 14 and made 6 starts down the stretch. But I just felt like when he was in there, it was so much above and beyond what we expected. And I don't know that Jaquan Brisker was. Jaquan Brisker was solid, but there were moments of mistakes and errors. And I kept feeling like we almost still wanted more from Brisker. We definitely wanted more from Gordon. I don't think Kyler Gordon is in this conversation. I think it's pretty much Sanborn or Brisker, maybe Braxton Jones. But it just felt to me like Sanborn was so solid in addition to exceeding expectations in that way. And that, the sample size thing, I'm not going to argue with you if you say, well, Brisker did it for 18 games and Sanborn did it for 6 starts and some change there. I won't disagree with that. I just feel like the guy who grabbed you, like, oh, that's the rookie of the year, like the rookie who came in and just made stuff happen more than you would expect a rookie player to do, was Jack Sanborn. And Brisker's right there, and it's not a shot on Brisker. I just felt like Sanborn, with the asterisks, was the rookie of the year for this Bears team. It's can be hard to find exactly the right positives here because so many different guys had so many different flaws, I think, along the way, and this team was not very good. Going through this exercise is a little bit of like reminding ourselves of like, yeah, it's hard to find like really strong candidates for some of these awards because you just didn't really have really strong players that deserved big time awards. But we'll go through the guys who got better this season, the comeback player of the year and the most improved player of the year, and try and differentiate the two. And I think at least one of the names will quite surprise you. The other one I'm not as like gung-ho about, but we'll kind of continue these Bears season awards next on Locked On Bears. The Locked On Bears podcast is presented by our friends at PrizePicks. PrizePicks is the better way to do daily fantasy sports, and it got even better because PrizePicks added even more to up the ante. Now on PrizePicks, you can pick 2 to 6 players, and if they score more or less than their PrizePicks projection, you can win up to 25 times your money on any entry. And what I love about PrizePicks is that it puts you in complete control. You're not competing against other people's lineups, right? Whether you win or lose on some of those other platforms requires, well, your lineup's got to be better than some stranger's lineup somewhere else in the country. But PrizePicks is just you versus the projections available. So it's all about your ability to pick the winners there. And that's not just for Bears football. It's not just for NFL football. It's any sport you watch. They've got picks at PrizePicks across professional sports, college sports, and some really obscure ones as well. And no matter what sport you want to play, it's super easy to enter. Literally takes 60 seconds or less. Download the PrizePicks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with our promo code LOCKEDON. If you deposit $100, PrizePicks will give you $100. If you deposit $50, PrizePicks will give you $50. Just don't forget to enter that promo code LOCKEDON at sign-up for that instant deposit match up to $100. When you sit there and think about which Bears players actually got better this season, guys that improved and exceeded expectations, it's not a long list, right? I mean, this is not a group of overachievers this season. There were guys that showed promise and guys that you can feel like have potential and things to be excited about moving forward, but like direct improvement from week 1 to week 18 or from last season to this season is a little bit harder to come by. Like when I think about most improved player, I want that to be a guy who, finished this season or was so much better this season than we thought they would be or than they were last year. That there was a market growth of like, guy went from being okay to being great, or guy went from being terrible to pretty good, like some real consistent improvement. And I contrast that with comeback player of the year, that I see as more about like overcoming something, which can also be exceeding expectations, but it's more about like what they've been through, whether that's an injury or, being a journeyman jumping around the league and, really trying to find some place to settle, but like really, reestablishing something in Chicago, that type of thing, which still requires improvement, right? It can't just be guy who was bad somewhere else comes to Chicago and is still bad, but some kind of improvement in addition to having overcome some amount of something. And I can't help but feel like Teven Jenkins kind of fits both categories. And I'm not giving him both awards here, but I think it kind of sticks with my Teven Jenkins theme of this podcast. That Teven Jenkins' comeback was from being injured, starting on injured reserve last season and kind of playing at the end of the year, but trying to get back 100% healthy and rolling and back in this team, right? There was a lot that he was kind of overcoming entering the season. Then you have what we discussed briefly earlier, the holdout situation, the disagreement, whatever was going on there where he wasn't participating at training camp. They were reportedly seeking a trade for him. The two sides had kind of broken down, and it felt like they were coming to a divorce. And somehow they patched it up, got him out on the field, and he played great. Like that feels comeback player of the year worthy. He also, I think, got better from week 1 to week 18 and got better from the guy we saw last year to the guy we saw this year. He made marked improvement in his game. And so I find myself wanting to make Teven Jenkins the most improved player, but not the comeback player of the year, because I have another good option for comeback player of the year, and I don't feel like I have another good option for most improved player. Eddie Jackson got better from last year to this year, but we also knew Eddie Jackson was good, right? It was about getting back to more of the Eddie Jackson level. It wasn't a surprise necessarily that we knew Eddie Jackson was capable of this because we have literally seen it. We thought Teven Jenkins was capable of this, but I don't know that we had fully seen it in the NFL yet. I also wondered about Cole Kmet, because there was some real improvement this season. He was the Bears' leading receiver and had a bunch of touchdowns. I was going to double check the number as I'm talking about it out loud. 7 touchdowns this season after 0 touchdowns last season. But it's hard to give him most improved player when his total number of catches and yards were both down from last year. Like, he was better, but it wasn't like this monumental leap forward for Cole Kmet. It was just like, oh, Jimmy Graham's gone, and the offense is actually like targeting him in the red zone now too, and making him a little bit more of an intentional part of the offense. So like, it didn't feel like he was like so drastically individually improved. And beyond that, it's hard to find a guy like Justin Fields improved a lot, but again, I don't want to give him MVP. Otherwise, I give him MVP, Offensive Player of the Year, and Most Improved Player. Like, it's just, it's not interesting enough to me, and it doesn't feel like the spirit of the award. But like other guys on defense, like Jalen Johnson didn't get like a ton better, but he was still Jalen Johnson. Kendall Vildor got better, I thought. That's a consideration in there too, but I just find myself feeling like Teven Jenkins was like he was the Bears player I think that had the best chance at the Pro Bowl. Besides, I guess, maybe Justin Fields, right? But like the guy who maybe wasn't Pro Bowl caliber all season, but like was the most consistently good player on both sides of the ball. So like I find myself with Teven Jenkins as the most improved player, because at comeback player of the year, the guy that stands out to me, and we got to set our expectations low here, right? Equanimeous St. Brown. Not that I thought Equanimeous St. Brown was this great wide receiver this year. I don't think Equanimeous St. Brown, ideally, he shouldn't see snaps on offense next season, right? I'm trying to be careful about how we couch this. Like, ideally, you have 4 or 5 better wide receivers on the roster next year than Equanimeous St. Brown. But what we saw this season, sort of in a vacuum from what's ideal in the future, he was the Bears' second leading wide receiver after Darnell Mooney. And for Equanimeous in particular, it was a career high. No, he was 5 yards short of a career high in yards. And he had the exact number of catches for a career high. After last season, he was cut at the 53-man roster deadline by Green Bay and had completely fallen out of the wide receiver rotation. And he felt like a guy who this offseason maybe Green Bay didn't really want. And we don't know how many teams really wanted him. He came in the Bears on basically a minimum deal, and we weren't sure if he was going to make the 53-man roster, and comes in here and certainly re-endears himself to Luke Getsy and finds a role in this offense and made some plays downfield. This is not to praise, again, this is not that Equanimeous St. Brown was great, but just that this was a comeback for him in his career. The Bears gave him an extension like already before. They didn't let him hit free agency and explore things. Like they gave him another 1-year deal and said, yes, we want you back. He blocked pretty well. He made some plays downfield. And I think it was a comeback for him in his career to stabilize a little bit more after things were really falling out in Green Bay. And now he's back to at least where he was at his best in Green Bay. And that's not a great wide receiver. And it's not a wide receiver that you want to be a big part of your offense. But I feel like it's a good candidate for comeback player of the year, because who else? Like I mentioned, Jenkins kind of fits that mold, but like there was so much turnover on this roster that like the guys who were injured last year are mostly just gone. Like I don't think Eddie Jackson was coming back from something. I mean, there were things in his life that he's now opened up about, but like it doesn't quite fit the mold as like this season was his comeback player of the year season. And there's just like not a lot of guys that would really qualify for that. And so that's why I like Equanimeous St. Brown is just kind of an interesting name and an interesting story, even if it's kind of subdued based on just the context of how bad the Bears were overall. Those are kind of the big main, awards that you see teams give out. And I didn't want to sit here and do a bunch of negative awards like most disappointing player or least improved player. I mean, like, we know how bad this Bears team is, right? Like, we don't need to sit here and be like, yeah, Chase Claypool was really disappointing. He would probably be, just off the top of my head, I didn't sit and think about this, but like maybe the most disappointing player this season, and least improved player, maybe Kyler Gordon, right? I mean, you can start to go through these things, and we don't need to flesh out all that. But I wanted to sort of be like, well, it's a 3-14 season. Where can we look at some of the positives and some of the awards here? And it also, I think, is illustrative of the lack of players that qualified for a lot of those things. Like, you can read between the lines and realize how bad things were, given that we were talking about Equanimous St. Brown as your comeback player of the year, and maybe Teven Jenkins as your offensive player of the year. Like, I think we can have a deeper conversation there. We can have a deeper understanding there that while we do talk about the positives, you can read between the lines and be like, yeah, hey, the reason that they're only talking about these guys as positives is because there weren't very many. And it also served as kind of a reminder of how bleak things were at times this season. But I would love to hear where you agree and disagree on some of these awards. Please, let us know in the comments on the Locked On Bears YouTube video. Tweet us at Locked On Bears. Post in the Locked On Bears Facebook group as well. Keep the conversation going. It's a great way to really be engaged with your fellow Bears fans and this podcast. Make sure you hit that subscribe button wherever you're listening to Locked On Bears or watching on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel. That's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen each and every day. Next week, we're going to be coming to you live from the Senior Bowl in Mobile, Alabama, breaking down all the prospects there and hearing from Luke Getsy himself. We'll get some clips of him talking on the podcast for that as well. So make sure you keep coming back for more of that. And of course, you have to come back for your next opportunity to bear, excuse me. Wow, absolutely failing on the dismount like an Olympic gymnast who just botches it at the very end. You got to come back for your next opportunity to bear down.